I never imagined that the cruelest words I would hear on the day I buried my husband would come from two strangers wearing expensive suits. They stopped me just before I reached my car, lowered their voices, and one of them said, "Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, we were sent to make sure you understand that your daughter-in-law wants you out of the house today. She intends to have the locks changed before you return." For a second, the world became strangely quiet. The church bells had stopped ringing. The last guests were drifting toward the parking lot, and the cold autumn wind carried away the final notes of the hymn that had played only minutes earlier. My husband, Thomas, had been laid to rest less than an hour before. 42 years of marriage had ended beneath a polished oak casket covered in white lilies. Yet somehow the greatest heartbreak of that day was still waiting for me outside the cemetery. I looked beyond the lawyers and saw my son, Daniel, standing beside his wife, Rebecca. She was dressed in elegant black, wearing dark sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. Her hand rested gently on Daniel's arm, and from where I stood, they looked like the grieving family everyone expected them to be. But Daniel never once looked toward me. Not once. Rebecca did. She lifted her chin ever so slightly, as if she already knew what those two men had come to tell me. There was no sympathy in her face, no sadness. Only the calm confidence of someone convinced the next chapter already belonged to her. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply thanked the lawyers for telling me the truth. They exchanged a brief glance, almost surprised by my composure. The older one introduced himself as Michael Harris, while the younger attorney quietly handed me a business card with another name beneath his own, Olivia Carter. "Please," Michael said softly, "don't drive home just yet. There are things you deserve to know first." I slipped the card into my purse without answering. My hands were steady, even though my heart felt unbearably heavy. Grief does something strange to a person. After losing the love of your life, another betrayal almost feels too unreal to hurt right away. I turned back toward the church entrance one last time. Friends who had known Thomas for decades were hugging each other, sharing memories and offering prayers. They believed the hardest part of my day had already passed. None of them knew that my family had quietly begun erasing me before the flowers on my husband's grave had even settled into the earth. Thomas always used to tell me that people reveal their true character when they think they have nothing left to lose or everything to gain. At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Standing there beside the cemetery parking lot, I realized he had been talking about family all along. Rebecca slowly walked Daniel toward their SUV without saying a word to me. My own son followed her as if pulled by an invisible string, never once asking if I needed a ride, never asking whether I wanted company, never even asking how I planned to get home after saying goodbye to the man I had loved for more than 4 decades. Watching them disappear felt colder than the November air. Michael cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Brooks," he said. "Thomas made preparations long before he passed away. He hoped we would never have to meet under these circumstances, but he was afraid this exact moment might come." I stared at him, searching his face for some sign that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Instead, I saw quiet sincerity. And for the first time that day, I realized my husband might have left behind far more than memories. Michael led me toward a quiet bench beneath a row of maple trees that bordered the church parking lot. The last of the mourners were beginning to leave, their cars disappearing one by one until only a handful remained. The air carried the familiar scent of damp leaves and fresh flowers, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself to sit down. My feet ached from standing through the service, but the weight on my heart was far heavier than any physical exhaustion. Olivia stood a respectful distance away, giving us privacy while quietly speaking with someone on her phone. Michael removed a sealed envelope from his leather briefcase, then rested it gently on the bench between us without offering it to me. "This belongs to you," he said. "But Thomas instructed us very clearly. You are not to open it until this evening, after you are somewhere safe." I looked at the envelope without touching it. Thomas had always been organized. Every important document in our home had a labeled folder. Every insurance policy, every tax return, every birthday card from our grandchildren was carefully filed away. If he had left instructions this specific, then he must have believed there was a reason. That thought unsettled me more than anything Rebecca had done. I quietly asked Michael the question that had been circling through my mind ever since he approached me. Did my husband know this would happen? He hesitated just long enough to answer honestly. He hoped it never would, but he prepared as though it might. Those words settled into my chest with surprising force. Thomas had never been suspicious by nature. He believed in giving people opportunities to prove themselves. He had welcomed Rebecca into our family with genuine kindness, helping Daniel and her buy their first home, paying unexpected medical bills during difficult years, and never asking for recognition. Yet over the last 2 years I had noticed small changes in him. He had become quieter during family dinners. Sometimes he would watch Rebecca speak without saying a word himself. More than once I caught him studying Daniel with a sadness I could never quite understand. Whenever I asked whether something was wrong, he always smiled and changed the subject. I had convinced myself he was simply growing older. Now I wondered if he had been carrying a burden alone because he wanted to protect me from it. My eyes drifted toward the cemetery entrance where Rebecca and Daniel's vehicle had already disappeared. The empty space they left behind somehow hurt more than if they had stayed to argue. Rebecca had always understood that cruelty delivered politely often left the deepest wound. She rarely raised her voice. Instead, she smiled while making decisions that slowly pushed me farther from my own family. Holiday dinners began changing without my knowledge. Weekend visits became shorter. Phone calls from Daniel became less frequent, often ending after only a few minutes because Rebecca supposedly needed him for something urgent. Every incident seemed too small to question by itself. Together, they formed a pattern I had refused to see. Michael folded his hands carefully. "Mrs. Brooks, I know today has already demanded more strength than anyone should be expected to give. But there is one thing I need you to promise." I nodded silently. "Please do not return to the house this afternoon. Not until we speak again." I looked directly into his eyes. "If I do not go home, where am I supposed to go?" Before he could answer, Olivia walked back toward us. Her expression remained calm, but there was urgency beneath it. "We have arranged a place for you to stay tonight," she said gently. A close friend of Thomas insisted on helping. "Everything has already been prepared." I blinked in surprise. Thomas had arranged even this. Somehow, despite the grief pressing against every breath I took, another feeling quietly began to rise beneath it. It was not hope yet. Hope felt too distant. It was something steadier than that. It was the growing realization that my husband had not left me defenseless. Whatever Rebecca believed, she had already won. Thomas had apparently spent months making certain that the final chapter of our family's story had not yet been written. Eleanor spent that evening in a quiet guest room overlooking a small lake on the edge of town. Thomas had brought me there once for our anniversary years earlier because he said the water always reminded him that even the roughest storms eventually settled. I had forgotten that place existed until Olivia opened the front door and an elderly couple welcomed me with the kind of warmth that only lifelong friends seem able to offer. Margaret and William never asked questions about the funeral. They simply placed a cup of hot tea in my hands, pointed me toward the bedroom upstairs, and told me I could stay as long as I needed. After dinner, I carried the sealed envelope to the window. Outside, the last light of the day faded behind the trees, leaving only the reflection of the room in the glass. My own face looked unfamiliar. The woman staring back at me appeared older than she had that morning, as though grief had quietly added years in a single afternoon. For several minutes, I simply held the envelope without opening it. Thomas had written my name across the front in his unmistakable handwriting. Seeing those careful letters brought back countless ordinary memories that suddenly felt priceless. Grocery lists left on the kitchen counter. Birthday cards tucked beside my breakfast plate. Notes reminding me to buy birdseed because he loved watching the cardinals gather outside our dining room window. Those simple moments had built our marriage far more than grand vacations or expensive gifts ever could. Finally, I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter folded around several documents. I unfolded the letter first. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then events have unfolded much as I feared. Please do not let fear make your decisions. Read everything before you speak to anyone. Trust Michael and Olivia completely. They know only what they need to know, but they know enough to guide you." I paused to wipe away tears before continuing. "I never wanted to burden you with my concerns while I was alive. I hoped I was wrong. I prayed that our family would choose kindness over ambition. But I have spent many months quietly preparing because hope is not the same as certainty." My hands trembled as I turned the page. Thomas explained that over the previous year, he had noticed financial conversations taking place whenever Rebecca believed he was out of earshot. She frequently asked Daniel questions about the house, retirement accounts, and legal ownership rather than asking how his parents were doing. At first, Thomas believed she was simply trying to understand our estate planning. Over time, however, the questions became more specific and increasingly urgent. He never accused her of wrongdoing. Instead, he documented conversations, organized records, and met privately with Michael several times to ensure every legal document accurately reflected our wishes. The next pages were copies of those records, each dated and carefully organized in the precise way Thomas approached everything important in life. There were notes in the margins written in blue ink. Short observations, quiet concerns, nothing dramatic, nothing angry, just facts. Reading them reminded me exactly why I had trusted him for more than 40 years. He never acted from impulse. He acted from careful thought. The final page contained one sentence written larger than all the others. Eleanor, if anyone tries to rush you into making a decision after I am gone, refuse politely and wait. Time reveals character more clearly than arguments ever will. I lowered the letter into my lap and looked out across the dark water. For the first time since the funeral, I understood that Thomas had not left me with revenge. He had left me with patience. Somewhere across town, Rebecca almost certainly believed her plan was already succeeding. She probably imagined I was frightened and alone. What she could not possibly know was that the man she underestimated had quietly prepared one final act of protection long before either of us realized how soon we would have to say goodbye. Early the next morning, I woke before sunrise, unable to remember where I was for the first few seconds. Then everything returned with painful clarity. Thomas was gone. Our home stood empty without me. Rebecca believed she had already taken control of my future. I folded Thomas's letter carefully and placed it back inside its envelope before joining Margaret and William downstairs. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen, and the simple kindness of a warm breakfast reminded me that compassion still existed outside the walls of my own family. Neither of them pressed me for details. Margaret simply reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and smiled. That quiet gesture carried more comfort than 100 speeches ever could. A little after 9 o'clock, Michael arrived with Olivia. They spread several folders across the dining room table, each one neatly labeled in Thomas's familiar style. Michael explained that Thomas had insisted every important document be copied and stored in multiple secure locations. He wanted to eliminate confusion and prevent anyone from claiming papers had been misplaced or misunderstood. As I listened, I realized just how much careful thought he had devoted to protecting our future. He had never mentioned these preparations because he believed that trust should remain intact for as long as possible. Only when trust failed would planning become necessary. Michael pointed to one folder containing property records, another containing financial instructions, and a third containing personal letters. Everything reflected the same careful pattern. Thomas had documented dates, conversations, and decisions without emotion or accusation. Facts stood on their own. Olivia looked at me gently before asking whether Rebecca had ever pressured me to sign anything during the previous year. I thought back through dozens of ordinary afternoons that had seemed meaningless at the time. Rebecca had occasionally suggested simplifying paperwork because she said it would reduce stress for everyone. Once she encouraged me to transfer certain household responsibilities to Daniel since, in her words, younger people understood modern finances better. I had politely declined, believing there was no urgency. Remembering those conversations now, I noticed details that grief had hidden before. Rebecca had always smiled while making suggestions that slowly shifted responsibility away from me. Nothing she said sounded unreasonable by itself. Together, they formed a careful pattern that Thomas had apparently recognized long before I did. Michael nodded thoughtfully as I finished speaking. He did not criticize Rebecca or speculate about her motives. Instead, he simply added another note to his file. That restraint reminded me of Thomas. Neither man rushed toward conclusions. They preferred evidence over assumptions. Around noon, my telephone vibrated for the first time since the funeral. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. His voice sounded tired, almost uncertain. He asked where I was and whether I planned to come home. I answered honestly that I was safe and staying with friends for the moment. There was a long silence before he quietly replied that Rebecca was making arrangements around the house and believed it would be easier if I collected my belongings later in the week. I closed my eyes for a moment, hearing not only his words, but also everything he failed to say. He never asked how I was sleeping. He never asked whether I had eaten. He never asked if I missed his father. We ended the conversation politely, but when the call ended, I realized that grief had revealed a distance between us that had been growing for years. Michael waited until I placed the telephone back on the table before speaking. "You did exactly the right thing," he said. "There is no need to argue. There is no need to rush. Let the documents speak when the time comes." I looked once more at Thomas's letter resting beside my coffee cup. For decades, my husband had quietly built our life, one careful decision at a time. Even after his passing, he was still teaching me the same lesson that had guided him throughout our marriage. Patience was not weakness. Sometimes it was the strongest form of courage a person could choose. The following afternoon, Michael called to let me know that several routine legal notifications had already been delivered. He never revealed every detail over the telephone, but his calm voice carried the quiet confidence I had come to trust. He asked whether I felt strong enough to drive with him to the house the next morning to collect a few personal belongings. I agreed, although the thought of stepping back inside the place where Thomas and I had built our lives filled me with equal parts comfort and sorrow. That evening, I walked alone along the edge of the small lake behind Margaret and William's home. The surface of the water reflected the fading colors of the sky, and I found myself remembering the first years of my marriage. Thomas and I had not started with very much. Our first house was barely 1,000 square feet. The kitchen was so narrow that only one person could stand comfortably beside the stove, and the old furnace rattled every winter. Yet we had laughed through those years because every improvement we made came from our own effort. We painted every room together. We planted the maple tree in the front yard with our own hands. When Daniel was born, Thomas built his crib in the garage because we could not afford the one displayed in the furniture store. Those memories reminded me that our home had never been valuable because of its market price. It mattered because it carried decades of ordinary moments that quietly became a lifetime. The next morning, Michael arrived exactly on time. During the drive, he explained that we would keep the visit brief and avoid unnecessary confrontation. If anyone attempted to argue, we would simply leave. There was no benefit in raising voices when patience remained our strongest ally. As we turned onto my street, I immediately noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked in the driveway. A moving company truck stood beside the garage, and several workers carried empty boxes through the front door. My heart tightened, but I remained silent. Michael parked along the curb and looked toward the house before speaking. "Remember what Thomas wrote," he said quietly. "Observe first. Respond later." We walked slowly toward the entrance. Rebecca opened the front door before we reached the porch. She wore a pleasant smile that never reached her eyes. She greeted Michael politely, then turned to me as though we had simply arranged an ordinary family visit. She explained that she was organizing the house because she believed everyone would benefit from a fresh start after such a difficult loss. Every sentence sounded thoughtful on the surface, yet each word carefully avoided acknowledging that no one had asked for my opinion. Daniel appeared a few moments later carrying a cardboard box filled with framed photographs. For an instant, our eyes met. He looked tired, uncertain, and older than I remembered only days earlier. He began to say something, then stopped when Rebecca gently touched his arm. That single gesture spoke louder than any conversation. I realized how often she interrupted moments that might have allowed him to think independently. Michael calmly requested access to my personal bedroom and the study. Rebecca hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. Inside the house, almost everything looked the same, yet something essential had changed. Family photographs had already been removed from several shelves. Decorative pieces that Thomas loved had disappeared from the living room. The house no longer reflected the people who had built it. It reflected someone preparing to rewrite its history. I quietly packed a small suitcase with clothing, my wedding album, several handwritten recipes passed down from my mother, and the worn leather Bible Thomas had carried every Sunday for more than 40 years. Those were the items no appraisal could ever value. As I closed the suitcase, I noticed one empty space on the bookshelf where Thomas had always kept a small wooden box. I turned toward Michael with a questioning expression. He smiled faintly and said only, "Do not worry." Thomas made certain the things that mattered most were already protected. At that moment, I understood that my husband had not been preparing to hold on to a house. He had been preparing to preserve the truth, and truth was far more difficult for anyone to remove than furniture or photographs. The drive back to Margaret and William's home was almost completely silent. My small suitcase rested in the back seat beside the wedding album, and I found myself looking through the window at familiar streets that suddenly felt as though they belonged to someone else's life. Michael finally spoke as we approached the edge of town. He told me that patience was beginning to accomplish exactly what Thomas had intended. People who believed they had already won often became careless. They stopped paying attention to details because they assumed there was nothing left to question. I understood what he meant the moment we arrived. Olivia was already waiting in the living room with another folder resting neatly on the coffee table. She smiled warmly and invited me to sit before opening it. Inside were copies of letters Thomas had written over several months. Some were addressed to me, others to Michael, and one remained sealed with Daniel's name written across the front. Michael explained that Thomas had instructed him not to deliver Daniel's letter until the appropriate time. Not yet, Thomas had written in one of his notes. My son deserves the truth, but only when he is willing to hear it without someone else's voice speaking for him. Reading those words brought tears to my eyes because they sounded exactly like the man I had known. Even in disappointment, Thomas refused to act from anger. He still believed Daniel could find his way back if given the opportunity to think for himself. Olivia then placed a legal document beside the letters. It confirmed that several family assets had already been transferred into a protected arrangement years before Thomas became ill. Every transfer had been completed legally, carefully, and with independent witnesses present. Nothing had been hidden. Nothing had been rushed. Thomas had simply chosen privacy over publicity. I suddenly remembered evenings when he told me he had another meeting with our attorney. Whenever I asked whether something was wrong, he would smile and tell me he was simply organizing paperwork so I would never have to worry about it. I had believed him because that was the kind of husband he had always been. He quietly solved problems before they reached our front door. Later that afternoon, my telephone rang once again. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. This time his voice carried a hesitation I had not heard before. He asked whether we could meet for coffee the following day without anyone else present. He admitted that the house already felt different and strangely empty. Rebecca had spent the afternoon rearranging furniture and discussing renovation ideas, even though the funeral had taken place only the day before. He confessed that something about it no longer felt right. I listened without interrupting. When he finished speaking, I agreed to meet him but made no promises beyond that. After the call ended, Michael looked at me with quiet understanding. People begin asking questions when events move faster than their conscience can comfortably follow, he said. That evening I carried Thomas's letters onto the back porch. The lake reflected the pale light of the moon, and a gentle breeze moved through the tall trees surrounding the property. I thought about every ordinary evening Thomas and I had shared over 4 decades. We had never measured our happiness by money or possessions. We measured it by trust. Trust had allowed us to build a family, a home, and a lifetime together. Losing Thomas had already broken my heart. Discovering that trust inside my own family had quietly weakened long before his passing was a different kind of sorrow altogether. Yet beneath that sorrow another feeling had begun to grow. It was not revenge. It was clarity. For the first time I understood that preserving Thomas's legacy did not mean holding tightly to every possession we had accumulated together. It meant protecting the values that had guided every decision he ever made. Honesty, patience, dignity. Whatever difficult conversations still waited ahead, I knew those values would remain my strongest foundation, just as they had always been his. The following morning, I arrived at the small neighborhood coffee shop 10 minutes early. Thomas had always believed that arriving first gave a person time to think before emotions entered the room, and I found myself smiling at the memory as I chose a table near the window. Outside, people hurried through their ordinary routines with paper cups in their hands, unaware that my own life had changed completely within a matter of days. I wrapped both hands around a warm mug of coffee, more for comfort than for the taste, and waited. Daniel walked in exactly on time. He looked exhausted. The confident man I had watched leave the cemetery beside Rebecca seemed replaced by someone carrying questions he no longer knew how to answer. He spotted me, hesitated for a brief moment, then slowly crossed the room and sat across from me. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Finally, he lowered his eyes and apologized for not calling sooner after his father passed away. His voice was quiet, uncertain, and filled with a sadness that sounded genuine. I accepted his apology without rushing to erase the hurt that still existed between us. Some wounds required honesty before they could begin to heal. Daniel admitted that the atmosphere inside the house had become increasingly uncomfortable. Rebecca had already contacted contractors about remodeling rooms that still contained many of Thomas's belongings. She had discussed paint colors, furniture placement, and future plans as though the house had instantly become a new project instead of the place where his father had built a lifetime of memories. Daniel confessed that hearing those conversations made him uneasy. He said he had tried to suggest waiting a few weeks, but Rebecca insisted that moving forward quickly was the healthiest way for everyone to grieve. I listened carefully without interrupting. Then I asked him a simple question. What do you believe your father would have wanted? Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he stared through the cafe window for a long time before quietly admitting that he no longer knew. That answer saddened me more than anything else he had said. Thomas had always spoken clearly about family, responsibility, and kindness. The fact that our son now struggled to recognize his father's values revealed how gradually outside influences had reshaped his thinking. I reached into my purse and removed the sealed envelope Thomas had left for Daniel. I placed it gently on the table between us. His expression changed the moment he recognized his father's handwriting. He reached toward it, then stopped. Michael said this was for me, he asked softly. I nodded. Your father wanted you to receive it when you were ready to listen with your own heart. Daniel carefully picked up the envelope, but did not open it immediately. He held it with both hands, tracing the familiar handwriting with his thumb. Tears formed in his eyes before he quietly thanked me. We finished our coffee speaking not about legal documents or property, but about Thomas himself. We remembered camping trips, Sunday breakfasts, and the way he never forgot anyone's birthday. By the time we stood to leave, I noticed something had shifted. Daniel had not suddenly solved every conflict in his life, nor had years of distance disappeared in a single conversation. But for the first time in a long while, he had spent an hour making decisions without anyone else's voice guiding him. As we walked toward the parking lot, he turned to me and said he intended to read the letter alone before discussing anything further with anyone. I simply wished him well and watched him drive away with the envelope resting on the passenger seat beside him. I could not predict what he would discover in his father's words, but I trusted Thomas completely. Throughout our marriage, he had never spoken merely to win an argument. He always spoke with the hope of helping someone find the truth for themselves. As I stood beside my car beneath the clear morning sky, I realized that this quiet meeting might become the first genuine step toward restoring something far more valuable than any house. It might become the beginning of my son finding his way back to the principles his father had spent a lifetime trying to teach him. 3 days later, Michael called to let me know that a formal meeting had been scheduled at his law office. Everyone whose name appeared in Thomas's final instructions had been invited. His tone remained calm, but I could hear the quiet confidence that had become familiar over the past week. He reminded me once again to let the documents speak for themselves. There would be no need for raised voices or accusations. Truth had a way of becoming clear when supported by careful preparation. On the morning of the meeting, I chose the navy blue dress Thomas always said brought out the color of my eyes. It was the same dress I had worn to Daniel's college graduation many years earlier. As I looked into the mirror, I realized I was no longer dressing to impress anyone. I was dressing to honor the life my husband and I had built together. Michael greeted me at the entrance to the office with a warm handshake. Olivia was already arranging several folders on the conference table. Everything looked orderly and deliberate. A few minutes later, Daniel arrived carrying the sealed envelope his father had left for him. His expression was thoughtful, and I noticed he held the opened letter inside a protective folder. He quietly told me he had read every page twice the night before. There was sadness in his eyes, but also a calm determination I had not seen in a very long time. Rebecca entered shortly afterward. She greeted everyone politely and took her seat with complete confidence. She smiled as though the meeting was simply another routine legal formality that would confirm everything she expected. She spoke briefly about moving forward, about making practical decisions, and about respecting Thomas's memory by avoiding unnecessary delays. No one interrupted her. Michael waited until the room became completely quiet before opening the first folder. He reviewed several routine documents that confirmed matters already understood by everyone present. Rebecca listened patiently, occasionally exchanging brief glances with Daniel. Then Michael reached for another folder marked with Thomas's signature. His voice remained measured as he explained that Thomas had prepared additional written instructions to be considered together with the primary estate documents. Olivia distributed copies to each person at the table. Rebecca's pleasant expression remained unchanged at first. She skimmed the first page with obvious confidence. Then she slowed. Her eyes returned to the beginning. She carefully reread several paragraphs before looking toward Michael with visible surprise. The documents explained that ownership arrangements concerning the family home and several other important assets had been finalized years earlier under carefully structured legal agreements. Every transfer had been properly witnessed, independently reviewed, and recorded. Nothing had been created after Thomas became ill. Every decision reflected his long-established wishes. Michael calmly explained that these arrangements were specifically designed to protect Eleanor Brooks from unnecessary pressure during a period of grief. He emphasized that Thomas believed major decisions should never be made while someone was experiencing profound personal loss. Daniel quietly removed his father's letter from the folder he had carried into the room. He looked toward Rebecca before speaking for the first time. He said his father had written that kindness should never be postponed for the sake of convenience, and that family should never become a competition over possessions. His voice remained steady throughout each sentence. I watched him carefully and realized he was no longer reading merely because the words had been written by his father. He believed them. The room grew remarkably still. Rebecca lowered her papers onto the table without saying anything. Michael continued reviewing the remaining documents with the same calm professionalism he had shown from the beginning. As I listened, I found myself thinking less about property and more about the quiet wisdom Thomas had carried throughout our marriage. He had never tried to control the future. He had simply prepared for it with patience, honesty, and extraordinary care. Sitting there in that conference room, I understood that his greatest legacy was not contained inside legal documents. It was found in the values that had guided every one of those decisions, values that still had the power to bring clarity even after he was gone. The meeting ended far more quietly than I had imagined during those long, sleepless nights after Thomas passed away. There were no dramatic arguments and no triumphant speeches. Michael simply gathered the signed documents while Olivia carefully organized the remaining files into neat folders. Rebecca sat silently for several moments before standing and thanking everyone in a voice that sounded smaller than it had when she first entered the room. She left the office without looking in my direction. Daniel remained seated. He continued holding his father's letter, reading one particular paragraph again before folding it carefully and placing it inside his jacket pocket. When the room was finally empty except for the three of us, he turned toward me with tears in his eyes. He admitted that he had allowed himself to become distracted by practical concerns while forgetting the values that had shaped his childhood. He told me he had remembered countless evenings when Thomas insisted that every important family decision should begin with compassion rather than convenience. Somewhere along the way, he confessed, he had stopped listening for his father's voice and started listening to louder ones. I reached across the table and gently held his hand. I told him that regret could become either a permanent burden or the beginning of wisdom. The choice belonged only to him. He nodded quietly and promised that rebuilding trust would take time, but he wanted to begin. Michael smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had witnessed exactly the outcome Thomas had hoped for. Before we left, he handed me one final envelope that had remained unopened throughout the meeting. It contained nothing related to property or finances. Inside was a short handwritten note from Thomas. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this after everything has been settled, then remember one thing above all else. A home is never protected by walls. It is protected by the character of the people who live inside it. If circumstances ever change, do not be afraid to create a new beginning. Carry our memories with you, but never allow them to become chains that keep you from living fully. I folded the note with a smile instead of tears. For the first time since saying goodbye to my husband, I felt peace beginning to replace grief. Over the following weeks, life settled into a quieter rhythm. I visited the house several times, not because I feared losing it anymore, but because I wanted to decide its future with a clear heart instead of a wounded one. Walking through each familiar room reminded me that every wall carried echoes of birthdays, family dinners, holiday mornings, and ordinary conversations that had quietly become precious memories. Eventually, I made a decision that surprised even me. Rather than treating the house as a symbol of victory or defeat, I chose to preserve it as a place where our family's better memories could continue. Daniel offered to help maintain the property, but only after asking my permission instead of assuming my agreement. That simple change in attitude meant more to me than any legal document ever could. Rebecca sent me a handwritten letter several weeks later. It contained no excuses and no lengthy explanations, only a sincere acknowledgement that grief and fear had influenced choices she wished she could now change. I accepted her apology without pretending that trust could immediately return. Some relationships heal slowly, just as broken bones require patience before they become strong again. As autumn gradually gave way to winter, I found myself returning often to the small lake behind Margaret and William's home. One quiet afternoon, I stood watching the gentle ripples across the water and thought about everything Thomas had done long before his final goodbye. He had not prepared complicated traps or dramatic surprises. He had simply protected the people he loved through wisdom, patience, and careful planning. His greatest gift was never the documents he left behind. It was the example of living with integrity even when no one else was watching. Whenever I think back to those difficult days now, I no longer remember the fear that met me outside the church. I remember the quiet strength that followed. Grief taught me that love does not end with a farewell, and truth does not disappear simply because someone tries to outrun it. Thomas kept his promise in the most meaningful way possible. Even after he was gone, he still found a way to guide me home.